You were nobody before me. You'll be nobody after me. Sign the papers and disappear. Preston Hayes slammed his hand flat on the conference table, making every person in the room flinch, every person except one. He shoved the divorce settlement across the surface toward his wife like he was sliding a tip to a server. $10,000. 11 years. One contemptuous flick of his wrist. He didn't even look at her when he said it. He was already texting someone else, already done with her, already certain she had no one, nothing, and nowhere to go. The old man sitting quietly in the back of the room said nothing. He didn't need to. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The conference room on the 41st floor of Meridian Tower was the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel small. The ceilings were high. The windows were floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the city like a judgment. The furniture was dark walnut and chrome, the kind of furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and was chosen precisely because it communicated without a single word that the people who sat in it had already won before the conversation began. Genevieve Hayes sat on the wrong side of that table. She had known walking in this morning that this was how it would feel. She had told herself she was prepared. She had stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 6:30 in the morning, in the small apartment she had moved into 3 weeks ago, after Preston told her to get out, and she had looked at herself for a long time. She had put on the gray blazer she used to wear when she worked lunch shifts at Callaway's back, before she met Preston. Back when she was 26, and tired and still somehow hopeful. It still fit. That felt like the one small victory she was allowed to carry into this room. She sat straight. She's kept her hands flat on the table. Across from her, Preston Hayes sat with the casual ease of a man who had never once in his life doubted that the world would bend in his direction. He was 44, lean, with the kind of haircut that cost $300, and looked effortless, which was the whole point. He wore a charcoal suit. His cufflinks were monogrammed. He had brought 2 attorneys, Richard Colton, who was the senior partner at Colton Waite and had reportedly never lost a case, and a younger associate whose name Genevieve had already forgotten because the young man had not introduced himself to her. He had introduced himself to Preston. Genevieve had brought Marcus Webb, a family law attorney she had found through a referral from a woman at her new apartment building. Marcus was good. She believed he was good. But he was one man sitting next to her, across from 2 attorneys and a husband who had spent 11 years learning exactly how to make her feel like she was one wrong word away from disappearing entirely. And then there was the old man in the back of the room. He had been there when she arrived. She had noticed him immediately. How could she not? He was the only other person in the room who was not a lawyer. He sat in one of the chairs along the wall. The chairs that were clearly meant for overflow for assistants and notaries and people who were present but not important. He was perhaps 70, with silver hair cut close to his head and the kind of stillness that most people only develop after they have lived through enough storms that weather no longer frightens them. He wore a dark suit, no tie. His hands were folded in his lap. Preston had glanced at him once when the proceedings began with the mild irritation of a man noticing a fly in the room. Then he had looked away and never looked back. Genevieve did not look at the old man at all. Richard Colton cleared his throat and opened the folder in front of him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, and even the way he said it, not unkindly, but with the practiced precision of a man who had done this many times and felt nothing particular about it, made the name feel like something she was already in the process of losing. "We've prepared a settlement agreement that we believe reflects a fair and equitable resolution of the marital estate." Marcus Webb opened his own folder. "Mr. Colton, we've reviewed your proposal. My client finds the terms inadequate. Mrs. Hayes contributed 11 years to this marriage, including significant support of Mr. Hayes's professional trajectory during the early years of—" "She was a waitress," Preston said. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't need to. He said it the way someone states a fact about the weather flat and uninterested, and then he took a sip of the coffee that had been waiting for him when he arrived. The good coffee, the kind brought up from the cafe on the lobby level, not the lobby coffee on 38, and he set the cup back down. Marcus paused. Excuse me. She was a waitress when I met her." Preston finally looked at Genevieve directly, and there was something almost curious in his expression, the way you might look at something you used to own and have since replaced. She had a GED and $2,000 in a checking account, and she was working doubles at a restaurant in Midtown. I gave her 11 years of the best life she has ever had and will ever have. $10,000 is generous. It's more than generous. Marcus turned to look at Genevieve, and she could see that he was surprised that he had prepared for a difficult negotiation, but perhaps not for this particular flavor of cruelty. He was waiting for her to react. She didn't. She looked at Preston. She held his gaze. She let his words sit in the air between them, without picking them up, without throwing them back, without letting them land on her skin. She had learned over 11 years how to do this. It was not a skill she had wanted to develop, but she had developed it. "Mr. Hayes," Marcus said carefully, recovering his composure, "your wife's non-financial contributions to the marriage are worth $10,000, Preston said. "That's our offer. It's not going to change. If she wants to fight it, we can fight it, and she can spend the next 18 months paying attorney's fees she can't afford and end up with less." He shrugged. One shoulder, half a shrug, like the whole conversation was not entirely worth a full one. "Or she can sign today and move on with her life, such as it is." The young associate, the one who hadn't introduced himself, wrote something in his notepad. Marcus leaned toward Genevieve and lowered his voice. "We don't have to agree to this. We have grounds to contest. The asset disclosure alone is incomplete. I've been saying that from the beginning. If we push for full financial discovery—" "How long?" she said. Her voice was quiet, steady. "Could be a year, could be longer. And the cost—" He paused. "It won't be cheap." She looked at the papers in front of her. The settlement agreement was 4 pages. She had read it the night before, sitting on the floor of her apartment, because she didn't own enough furniture yet to fill the space reading each line by the light from the window and a floor lamp she had bought at a second-hand store on Amsterdam Avenue. She had read it 3 times. She knew what it said. She knew what it meant. She picked up the pen. "Genevieve." Marcus put his hand on the table, not touching her arm, but close. "You don't have to do this right now." "I know," she said. She signed her name. Preston watched her do it. She felt his eyes on her hand as the pen moved, and then she heard something she had not expected, a small exhale from him. Not relief. Something closer to satisfaction. The sound a man makes when he confirms a belief he has always held about the world, about himself, about the people around him. She had just confirmed his belief that she was exactly what he had always told her she was. She set the pen down. Richard Colton reached across the table and collected the papers with the smooth efficiency of a man who did this for a living, and she thought, this is it. This is the end of 11 years, 4 pages and a signature and a cup of coffee that wasn't offered to her. "Well?" Preston said, and he was already reaching for his phone, already done with her, already moving on to the next thing in his life. "Good luck, Genevieve." The way he said her name this time was almost pitying. Almost. "I mean that." She said nothing. She gathered her things, her purse, the small folder Marcus had brought that contained copies of documents she had already memorized. She pushed back her chair, and then the old man in the back of the room stood up. He did it slowly. Not because he was frail, she could see watching him that he was not frail in the least, but because he moved with the deliberate pace of someone who has not been in a hurry for a very long time. He straightened his jacket. He buttoned the single button. He walked toward the table, and his footsteps were quiet on the carpet. But something about the weight of him, the absolute unhurried certainty of his movement through the space, caused Richard Colton to stop mid-sentence in something he had been saying to his associate. Preston looked up from his phone. The old man did not look at Preston. He looked at Genevieve. "Are you ready?" he said. His voice was low and even, and it carried the particular quality of a voice that has spent decades being listened to, not demanded attention, but received it simply because it was the voice in the room that knew what it was talking about. Genevieve looked at him. And for the first time that morning, something in her face changed. Not broke, not crumpled. Changed the way a landscape changes when a cloud moves and the light comes through differently. "Yes," she said. Preston was looking at the old man now. There was a slight furrow between his brows, the beginning of a question forming. "I'm sorry. Who are you exactly? Are you with her attorney's office?" The old man finally looked at Preston. "No," he said. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and placed a business card on the table. Not handed it, placed it, set it flat on the dark walnut surface and left it there, and walked toward the door without another word. Preston picked up the card. The room went very quiet. Genevieve watched his face. She watched the moment the words registered. She watched the color change in his neck, first, then his jaw, then the thin skin beneath his eyes. She watched his hand tighten almost imperceptibly on the card. She watched him read it a second time, because the first time had not computed. The first time the brain had simply refused to process what the eyes were telling it. She picked up her purse. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and turned back, not to Preston, but to Marcus, who was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "I'll call you." And then she walked out. In the hallway, the old man was waiting by the elevator. He was looking at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked so completely at ease in this building, in this corridor, in this morning, that she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was still clenched. "You didn't have to be there," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I know," Silas Archer said. "He didn't recognize you." "No, he didn't." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors slid open. They stepped inside. "I signed it," she said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. She was not sure what it was. "I saw. Marcus thinks I should have fought it." "Marcus is a good lawyer," Silas said. "Fighting is not always the same as winning." He pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. "Do you know the difference?" She looked at the polished steel of the elevator doors and at her own reflection in them, at the gray blazer she had worn when she was 26, and tired and still somehow hopeful, and she thought, yes. She thought, "I have known the difference for a long time, and that is exactly why I signed." "Yes," she said, "I know the difference." Silas nodded once slowly the way he did everything. The elevator began to move. Back in the conference room on the 41st floor, Preston Hayes was still holding the business card. His two attorneys were watching him. The young associate had stopped writing. Richard Colton had gone very still. On the card, in plain black letters on a cream background, it read, "Silas Archer, Archer Industries, Chairman and CEO," and below that in smaller letters, "Consolidated net assets $4.7 billion. Preston set the card down on the table. He picked up his coffee. He set it back down without drinking. "Who is Silas Archer?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question, because some part of him already knew the answer was coming and was bracing for it, to Genevieve. Richard Colton cleared his throat. He was already on his phone, already searching, and his face, which had been composed and professional since the moment they arrived, was doing something now that Preston had never seen it do in 7 years of being Richard Colton's client. It was doing something that looked like concern. "Sir," Richard said, "just tell me." Richard looked up from his phone. "He's her father." The words sat in the room. Preston heard them. He processed them the way you process something that your brain initially classifies as impossible. A slow grinding recalibration of everything you thought you understood about the last 11 years, about the woman you had just dismissed with $10,000, and a half shrug about the quiet waitress from Midtown you had rescued, about the woman who had just signed those papers without a single word of protest. "That's not," Preston started. "Her legal name before the marriage," Richard said, reading from his phone, and his voice had changed, now had taken on a careful, measured quality that Preston recognized as the voice Richard used when delivering news that required immediate strategic response. "Was Genevieve Archer. She changed it when she was 23, before she started working in the service industry, before she met you." Richard set his phone on the table. "She has been the sole heir to Archer Industries for, it appears, the entirety of her adult life." The young associate put down his pen. Preston looked at the door through which Genevieve had just walked. The door was still. The hallway beyond it was empty. The elevator had already gone. He looked at the card on the table. He thought about the $10,000 settlement. He thought about the words he had said, "She was a waitress. That's our offer. Good luck, Genevieve. I mean that." And he heard them again in the new context, in the context of this card on this table, and the sound of them was different now. The sound of them was something he had never heard himself produce before. The sound of a man who has just made the worst mistake of his life in front of a witness who was placed there precisely so that every word would be heard, observed, and remembered. He reached for his coffee again, and this time he noticed that his hand was not entirely steady. Downstairs in the lobby of Meridian Tower, Genevieve and Silas walked through the revolving doors and out into the morning air. A black car was waiting at the curb. The driver was already out holding the door. "There will be phone calls," Silas said as they walked. "I know. From his attorneys, from Preston himself most likely, probably by this afternoon." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" She paused at the edge of the curb and turned to look back at the building they had just left. 41 floors up behind one of those windows, Preston Hayes was sitting with a business card in his hand, and the first real fear of his life beginning to bloom in his chest. And she knew that, and she felt it, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel it. Then she turned back to the car. "I've been preparing for 11 years, she said. She got in. Silas folded himself in beside her, unhurried, and the door closed, and the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, and Genevieve looked out the window at the street moving past at the city, going about its morning ordinary and oblivious, and she thought about the moment she had signed the papers, about the deliberate, calm act of releasing a grip that had been cutting into her hands for so long she had stopped feeling the pain of it. She had not signed because she was giving up. She had signed because she was done pretending that the fight was happening in that room. The real fight had not even begun yet. And Preston Hayes, sitting 41 floors above the street she was driving through, had just wasted the only advantage he'd ever had over her, the advantage of her silence, by confirming every single thing she had needed him to confirm in front of a man whose quiet presence in that room had been anything but irrelevant. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a number she did not recognize. It said, "I heard what he said to you in there. I want to help." She looked at the message for a moment. Then she turned her phone over in her lap and looked back out the window. "Dad?" she said. How many people did you bring today?" Silas Archer looked straight ahead. The ghost of something that might have been in another man, a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "Enough," he said. She nodded. Outside the window, the city kept moving. Ordinary, oblivious. And somewhere far above it, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and dark walnut furniture, a man who had spent 11 years believing he was the most powerful person in the room was beginning to understand slowly the way the truly devastating realizations always come that he had never been in control of a single thing. Not once, not ever. And the woman he had dismissed with $10,000 and a half shrug was the reason why. Her name was Genevieve Archer, and she had only just begun. The black car had barely turned the corner from Meridian Tower when Preston Hayes' phone rang for the first time. He looked at the screen. Richard Colton. He let it ring twice before he answered, which was something he had never done before with Richard, because Richard Colton was not the kind of attorney whose calls you let ring. You answered immediately. That was the unspoken agreement between a man of Preston's position and the lawyer who protected it. But Preston needed 2 rings to compose himself. And that more than anything that had happened in the last 20 minutes told him how badly the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Richard," he said, "we need to talk." Richard's voice had none of its usual smooth confidence. It was clipped, deliberate, the voice of a man choosing every word with surgical care. "Not on the phone. Can you come back up?" "Tell me what you found." A pause. "Preston? Tell me on the phone, right now." Another pause, longer this time. Preston heard Richard exhale, and he heard in that exhale everything he needed to know about how bad this was going to be. Archer Industries. Richard said, is not simply a large company. It is a privately held conglomerate with controlling interest in 43 subsidiaries across 11 industries. The consolidated net worth of the Archer portfolio as of last fiscal year was approximately $4.7 billion. A beat. With a B. Preston said nothing. Silas Archer has been the chairman and sole decision-maker of that organization for 31 years. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the 10 most powerful private businessmen in this country. He does not give interviews. He does not appear at public events. He operates almost entirely without media attention, which is, and I say this as someone who has worked in corporate law for 26 years, one of the most sophisticated and deliberate power strategies I have ever encountered in a private individual. Still, Preston said nothing. His daughter, Richard continued, and now his voice dropped just slightly, the way voices drop when delivering the part of the news that actually matters. His only daughter changed her last name at 23, moved to a different city, and by all appearances chose to live entirely outside of her father's public profile. There is almost nothing connecting her publicly to the Archer name. No social media, no property records in her birth name, no professional listings. Another pause. Which means, Preston, that for 11 years you were married to the sole heir of a $4.7 billion empire and you had absolutely no idea. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, the kind you could press your hand against and feel pushing back. "The settlement," Preston said finally. His voice was careful now, very careful. "The papers she signed this morning, are they legally binding?" Richard said. "She signed. It's done." "Then we're fine." "Preston," Richard said his name with a patience that was itself a warning. "We are not fine. We are very far from fine. Silas Archer did not come to that conference room this morning as a witness. He came as an observer. There is a significant difference. A witness is present by invitation. An observer is present by choice. He chose to be in that room. He chose to hear everything that was said. And what was said in that room—" Richard stopped. "What about what was said?" "What you said specifically," Richard replied. "On the record, in front of his attorney, your attorney, 2 support staff, and the man himself. You told his daughter she was worth $10,000. You told her she was a waitress. You told her to go back to where she came from." A long pause. And Silas Archer heard every single word. Preston stood up from the chair he had not realized he had sunk into. He walked to the window of his office. He had come back to his own office on the 37th floor, rather than going back to the conference room, needing the familiarity of his own space, his own view, his own air. He looked out at the city below. "He can't undo the settlement," Preston said. "She signed it." "No," Richard agreed. "He can't undo the settlement." A pause that Preston did not like at all. "But that's not the question I'd be asking right now if I were you." "Then what is the question?" "The question," Richard Colton said slowly, "is what a man like Silas Archer does next, when someone has done what you did to his daughter in front of him on the record." Another pause. "That's the question, Preston, and I don't have a good answer for you." The call ended. Preston stood at the window for a long time. Below him, the city moved. Taxis, people, ordinary Tuesday morning traffic that had no idea that anything had changed. He looked at it and felt for the first time in a very long time something he did not immediately recognize because it had been so long since he had felt it. He felt small. He dismissed it almost immediately. He was Preston Hayes. He had built his position at Coincidental Capital from associate to senior VP in 9 years. He managed a portfolio of nearly $200 million. He had connections in 3 different industries and a reputation that had taken years to construct. One old man with a business card was not going to dismantle that. Billionaire or not, Silas Archer was still one man. Preston told himself this very firmly, and then his office phone rang, and it was his assistant Dana. And Dana's voice had a quality in it that he had also never heard before in the 4 years she had worked for him, and that quality was something very close to fear. "Mr. Hayes," Dana said, "Mr. Hargrove is calling for you, from the executive floor." Preston's stomach tightened. David Hargrove was the CEO of Coincidental Capital. In 9 years, David Hargrove had called Preston Hayes directly exactly 4 times. 3 of those times had been to congratulate him on major portfolio wins. The 4th had been to tell him his bonus was being increased. David Hargrove did not call to deliver bad news personally. He had people for that. "Put him through," Preston said. There was a click, and then David Hargrove's voice came on the line, and it was the voice of a man who was controlling something very carefully. "Preston, how are you?" It was not a question. "Fine, David. What can I'm going to need you to come up to my office this afternoon, 2 o'clock. A pause. "We have some things to discuss regarding your accounts." "My accounts are performing well. The meridian position alone." 2:00, Preston. The line went quiet for a moment. "Don't be late." The call ended. Preston looked at his phone. He looked at the time. It was 9:47 in the morning. He had 4 hours and 13 minutes before whatever was going to happen at 2:00 happened. He picked up his phone and called his personal contact at Colbright's internal compliance team, a man named Gary Finch, who owed him 2 favors and played golf with his assistant. Gary answered on the first ring. "Gary," Preston said, keeping his voice completely level. "What's going on upstairs?" A long silence. Too long. "Gary." "Preston, I can't. What is going on upstairs?" "I don't know the details," Gary said, and his voice was low, the voice of someone speaking quietly in a space where they do not want to be overheard. "But there's been a call. This morning, from outside the firm. High level. Someone called Hargrove directly, not through channels, not through the board directly. And after that call, there were 3 people in the compliance office pulling files." A pause. "Your files, Preston." The room went very still. "What files?" "The Orchard Bridge transactions," Gary said. "The ones from Q3 last year, and the Sentinel account reallocation." A pause that felt like a door closing. "Preston, I really can't say any more than that." "Gary, I'm sorry." The line went dead. Preston set his phone down on his desk. He sat very still. He looked at his hands, which were completely steady, because Preston Hayes had spent 20 years training himself not to show physical reactions to stress, and the training held even now when his mind was doing something that felt like running very fast in several directions simultaneously. The Orchard Bridge transactions, the Sentinel account reallocation. Those were not files anyone should be pulling. Those were files that were on their surface entirely legitimate, and which Preston had spent considerable energy ensuring appeared entirely legitimate, and which were in fact a very different thing underneath that surface. And the only people who knew that were Preston himself and one other person, and that other person had been very carefully selected for their discretion. Someone had told someone. His mind went immediately instinctively to the question of who, and then it went somewhere else, somewhere colder. The question of how long someone had been gathering before they decided to pull. He thought about Silas Archer in the back of the conference room, hands folded, watching. He thought about the text message he had seen on Genevieve's phone as she left the room. He had caught only a glimpse, not enough to read, but enough to see that she had received a message and that she had looked at it and turned her phone over without reacting. He thought about how Genevieve had signed those papers without hesitation, without argument. Without the kind of hesitation that a person shows when they are giving something up. He thought about how she had not looked like someone giving something up. He thought about how she had looked actually like someone setting something down that they no longer needed to carry. Preston Hayes, for the first time in 11 years of knowing, Genevieve felt the specific cold clarity of realizing that he had been reading her entirely wrong. Not occasionally, not in small ways. Entirely wrong, comprehensively. For over a decade, and that realization arrived in his chest not as humility, but as something harder and sharper, because the gap between what he had believed about her and what was apparently true was so vast, so complete, that it didn't just change his understanding of her, it changed his understanding of himself, of his own judgment, of the machinery of his own perception. He had believed he was the most perceptive man in every room he entered. He had built his career on that belief. He had staked his reputation on it. And the woman he had dismissed as a waitress had been the daughter of a billionaire for the entirety of the time he had known her, and he had not once in 11 years seen it. His intercom buzzed. Dana again, her voice even more careful than before. "Mr. Hayes, there are 2 men in the lobby asking for you. They say they're from the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority." Preston did not move. "They say it's a routine inquiry," Dana continued, "but they don't have an appointment, and they—" She stopped. "They say they'd prefer not to wait." He closed his eyes. He opened them. FINRA, in his lobby, before 10 in the morning, without an appointment. On the same day he had divorced the daughter of Silas Archer. There was no version of this that was a coincidence. He straightened his jacket. He squared his shoulders. He did the thing he had always done when circumstances moved against him, which was to project the absolute unruffled calm of a man who had anticipated everything and was troubled by nothing. He had done this in difficult board meetings. He had done this in hostile negotiations. He had done this in every moment of professional adversity for 20 years, and it had always worked because the appearance of calm was itself a form of power. And Preston Hayes understood power. He walked to his office door. He opened it. He looked at Dana, who was watching him with an expression she was working very hard to keep neutral. "Tell them I'll be down in 5 minutes," he said. "Yes, sir." He went back to his desk. He sat down. He took out his phone and did the one thing he had not yet done this morning, the thing he had been avoiding, because doing it meant acknowledging something he was not ready to acknowledge. He pulled up Genevieve's contact information. He looked at her name on his screen for a long moment. Then he called her. It rang 4 times. Then her voicemail, her voice calm and unhurried. "You've reached Genevieve. Leave a message." He hung up without leaving one. He sat there for a moment longer, and then something occurred to him, a memory sudden and specific from 8 months ago. A conversation he had overheard without meaning to late on a Sunday evening when he had come home early from a trip, and Genevieve had been on the phone in the kitchen speaking quietly, and he had caught only a fragment before she heard him and ended the call. She had said, "Not yet, Dad. Not yet, but soon." He had thought nothing of it at the time. He had assumed she was speaking to some distant relative, some estranged family member she occasionally mentioned in vague general terms, the parents who had not been part of her adult life, who she did not discuss. He had not asked. He had not been interested. Not yet, Dad. Not yet. But soon. 8 months ago. She had been telling her father, Silas Archer, chairman of Archer Industries, $4.7 billion, 31 years of invisible power. She had been telling him to wait, to hold. Not yet. And the man had waited. And she had chosen the moment herself, and she had chosen it with the kind of precision that Preston now understood he had been catastrophically wrong to mistake for passivity. She had not been a passenger in her own life. She had been driving it the whole time. From a lane he had never thought to look in. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It read, "The FINRA visit is just the beginning, Preston. There are also conversations happening right now at 3 of your largest institutional clients. I thought you should know. Not as a threat, as a courtesy. The kind of courtesy you didn't offer her this morning. No signature, no name. He didn't need one." He sat in his office with the view he had worked 20 years to earn, with the framed awards on the wall and the imported furniture and the handmade Italian shoes beneath his desk, and he read that message 3 times. And then very quietly, without any audience, without anyone to perform composure for Preston Hayes, set his phone face down on his desk and pressed both hands flat against the surface and took a breath that shook slightly at the edges, because he understood now. He understood what had happened this morning. He understood that the conference room on the 41st floor had not been a divorce proceeding. It had been a stage, and every word he had said, every contemptuous dismissal, every careless cruelty delivered with the confident ease of a man who believed himself untouchable, all of it had been observed, recorded in the mind of a man who had spent 31 years learning how to dismantle things quietly, efficiently, and without warning. Genevieve had signed those papers and walked out of that room and taken nothing with her, because she didn't need anything from that room. Everything she needed was already in motion. He picked up his jacket. He straightened his tie. He went downstairs to meet the men from FINRA in his lobby, and he smiled at them with the practiced warmth of a man who had nothing to hide. And as he shook their hands, he thought about a black car pulling away from the curb on a Tuesday morning, and a woman looking out the window at the ordinary city going about its ordinary day, and the absolute stillness on her face. Not grief, not anger, not relief. Something older and quieter than all of those things combined. He had called it emptiness once, looking at her across dinner tables and boardroom events and 11 years of shared space. He had told himself she was hollow, simple, easy to dismiss. He knew standing in his own lobby, shaking hands with federal regulators on the worst morning of his life, that what he had seen on her face was not emptiness at all. It was patience, and it had run out. 3 weeks passed. To anyone watching from the outside, those 3 weeks looked like nothing, like the ordinary settling of dust after a divorce. Preston Hayes went to work. He met with the FINRA representatives twice more, both times, with Richard Colton sitting beside him, both times walking out with the controlled expression of a man who had handled the situation. He told Gary Finch the inquiry was routine. He told his assistant Dana that everything was fine. He told himself every morning in the mirror of his penthouse bathroom that he had weathered worse than this and that the storm would pass. He was very good at telling himself things. What he could not see, because it was designed specifically so that he could not see, it was that those 3 weeks were not settling dust. Those 3 weeks were construction. Quiet, precise, load-bearing construction of the kind that does not announce itself until the moment the structure is complete, and you look up and realize the entire architecture of your world has been rebuilt around you while you were standing in the middle of it. Genevieve spent those 3 weeks in the 49th floor offices of Archer Industries' Eastern headquarters in a corner office that had been empty for 2 years and which now had her name on a small, unadorned placard beside the door. Not her married name, her name, Genevieve Archer, Chief Strategic Officer, Eastern Division. It was a title that had been created for her, not because she needed a title, but because the organizational structure of what was coming required that she have one. She arrived every morning at 7:15. She left every evening after 8. She ate lunch at her desk. She did not take calls from Preston, whose number appeared on her phone 6 times in the first week and 3 times in the second, and not at all in the third, which told her something about the arc of his panic more clearly than any report could have. Her core team was 4 people. Diane Cho, 38, who had been with Archer Industries for 12 years and had the particular gift of reading financial structures the way other people read faces. Thomas Reed, 44, former federal prosecutor turned corporate compliance specialist who spoke rarely and precisely and whose silence in a room always meant he was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. A data analyst named Priya Vasan who could map corporate relationships across subsidiaries and shell structures the way a cartographer maps coastlines with patience and absolute accuracy. And Marcus Webb, her divorce attorney, who had been surprised to receive a second call from her and more surprised still by what she asked him to do. "You want me to be part of this," Marcus had said when she laid it out for him. "I want you to understand the full picture," she said. "What happened in that conference room was one piece. I want you to see the rest." He had been quiet for a moment. Then, when you walked in that morning with the gray blazer and the flat hands on the table, you already knew all of this was coming. "Yes, you weren't nervous." "No, you signed those papers on purpose, not because you had to, because you wanted him to believe you had to." She looked at him steadily. "I signed those papers because I was done, not because I was defeated. There's a significant difference." She paused. "You said something similar to me once, about fighting and winning." Marcus sat back in his chair. He looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. Then he picked up the folder she had placed in front of him and opened it. "All right," he said. "Show me." What he found in that folder, what all 4 of them had spent 3 weeks assembling, was not a story of a bad husband. It was a story of a man who had spent 9 years constructing a professional identity that was part performance and part outright fraud, layered so carefully that from any single angle it looked legitimate, but viewed from above, from the comprehensive aerial perspective that Priya's mapping made possible, revealed a pattern so deliberate and so sustained that it could not be explained as error or oversight. The Orchard Bridge transactions that FINRA was already examining were the most visible thread. But there were others, a series of client account reallocations that had generated fees that should not have existed, a consulting arrangement with a subsidiary of one of Colbright Capital's own portfolio companies undisclosed running for 3 years, and the one that Thomas Reed had identified with the flat, quiet certainty of someone who had seen this before in a federal courtroom, a data-sharing arrangement, informal, undocumented, but traceable through communication records between Preston Hayes and a competitor firm called Vantage Meridian Capital. Proprietary client data shared without authorization for what appeared to be a reciprocal arrangement involving positioning information that had allowed both parties to make moves that looked at in isolation appeared fortunate. Looked at together appeared to be something else entirely. "This crosses the line into federal territory," Thomas Reed said on the morning of the 18th day in Genevieve's office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was talking. "This isn't regulatory. This is criminal." "I know," Genevieve said. "The FBI will need to be involved. If we bring this to them with the documentation Priya has assembled, they will open a case. And once that case is open," he paused, "it won't be quiet, it won't be quick, and it won't be something he can negotiate away." "I know that too." Thomas looked at her. "I want to make sure you understand what you're setting in motion. This isn't just the end of his career. This is the end of his freedom, potentially. 5 years minimum on the federal charges alone if the espionage element holds." Genevieve was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was doing what cities do on ordinary mornings, which is move forward without looking back. She had always found something comforting in that, the city's absolute indifference to the weight of individual moments. "He stood in a room," she said, "and told me I was worth $10,000. He said it in front of my father. He said it in front of his own attorneys. He said it with the confidence of a man who had said similar things to me privately for 11 years and had never once experienced a consequence." She looked at Thomas. "I'm not setting this in motion because I'm angry. I'm setting it in motion because it's true, and things that are true have a right to be seen." Thomas nodded once. He picked up his cold coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. "Then let's make sure it's seen correctly," he said. On day 21, a Monday morning, Colbright Capital's board received a formal notification from Archer Industries' legal team. The notification was 6 pages long, precise, and completely without theatrics. It outlined Archer Industries' acquisition of a 14% stake in Colbright Capital's parent holding company through a series of purchases made over the previous 8 months, purchases made quietly through intermediary funds, in increments small enough not to trigger disclosure requirements, but large enough accumulated to constitute a significant and actionable position. 14%, acquired over 8 months. Starting, Genevieve knew approximately 2 weeks after the Sunday evening when she had told her father, "Not yet, Dad. Not yet, but soon." He had started building the position before she even asked. That was Silas Archer. That was the man who had watched and waited and folded his hands in the back of a conference room and let his daughter's husband say every terrible thing he had to say because every word had been evidence, and Silas had been collecting it. The board meeting that followed the notification was by all accounts the most tense 2 hours in Colbright Capital's 30-year history. David Hargrove, who had called Preston to his office 3 weeks earlier with the controlled voice of a man managing a situation, was now in a situation that had exceeded his management capacity. Archer Industries' 14% stake came with specific governance rights, negotiated quietly into the acquisition structure. And those rights included the right to appoint an observer to the board and to call for a special review of any executive whose conduct was currently under federal regulatory examination. Preston Hayes' conduct was currently under federal regulatory examination. The board voted. It was not close. That same afternoon at 2:17, Preston received a call from David Hargrove. Not an invitation to come upstairs. Not a request for a meeting. A direct call, brief and formal, informing him that pending the completion of the FINRA inquiry and a related internal compliance review, he was being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately with all system access suspended and all client relationships reassigned. Administrative leave, effective immediately. He was escorted from the building by a member of HR and a security officer. His personal items would be boxed and delivered. His access card was collected at the lobby desk. He stood on the sidewalk outside Colbright Capital's building, the building he had entered every morning for 9 years, the building whose lobby he had walked through hundreds of times with the easy confidence of a man who belonged there, who had earned his place there, who was building something there. And he stood on that sidewalk for a long moment with the cardboard box of personal items under his arm and the city moving around him and nowhere immediately to go. He called Genevieve. He had not called in 10 days. Something about the silence of the 3rd week had stopped him. Some instinct for self-preservation that told him each call was being noted, logged, used in some way he did not fully understand. But now, standing on the sidewalk with the box under his arm, the instinct failed, and he called her. She answered on the 2nd ring. "Preston," she said. Her voice was exactly what it had always been. Calm, unhurried. The voice he had mistaken for passivity for 11 years. "What did you do?" he said. He meant it to sound controlled. It didn't. "I didn't do anything to you," she said. "The things that are happening to you are the result of things you did. There's a difference." "Genevieve, you need an attorney," she said. "Not Richard Colton. Someone who specializes in federal criminal defense. I'm serious, Preston. Get one today." A pause. "Not because I'm telling you to, because anyone who understood your situation clearly would tell you the same thing. Are you threatening me?" "No." Her voice didn't change, not a degree. "I'm telling you what's true. I've been doing that for 11 years, and you've never once heard it, so I understand if it sounds unfamiliar." A pause. "Get an attorney. Today." She ended the call. He looked at his phone. He looked at the box under his arm. A woman walking past him glanced at the box and then at his face, and then away quickly, the way people look away from things they have correctly identified as none of their business. He got in a cab. He went home to his penthouse. He sat in his living room, with the view that cost 4,000 square feet of Manhattan real estate, with the furniture that had been selected by an interior designer, and the art on the walls that had been chosen as investment pieces. And he called Richard Colton and got voicemail, and called again and got voicemail again, and the third time Richard answered and said very carefully that he was no longer the right attorney for this situation, and that he could provide several referrals to colleagues who practiced in the relevant area. Richard Colton was withdrawing. Preston sat with the phone in his hand after that call ended and understood with the slow and terrible clarity of a man who has been watching the horizon and has just noticed that the water is pulling back from the shore, that this was not a storm he was going to weather. This was the shore pulling back before a wave. He had one move left. He told himself it was a business decision. He told himself it was strategy. He had a contact at Vantage Meridian Capital, a man named Everett Cross, who had been the other party in the data-sharing arrangement, who had as much to lose as Preston did, and who had, in Preston's assessment, the resources and the motivation to do what needed to be done to make this stop. He sent Everett a message. Encrypted, the same channel they had always used. He said, "I need access to the Archer file structure, the Colbright overlap data. If we can reframe the narrative before the federal review is complete, we can shift the focus. I can get into the system tonight. Meet me at the following location." He sent it. He did not know, could not have known, because the depth of what had been built against him was precisely calibrated to be invisible until the moment it was not that the encrypted channel had been compromised for 11 days, that every message sent through it for 11 days had been received by Thomas Reed's team simultaneously with its intended recipient, that the message he had just sent had been read, logged, and forwarded to 2 people within 4 minutes of its sending. One of those people was Thomas Reed. The other was an FBI special agent named Carroll, who had been quietly assigned to the case 9 days earlier and who had been waiting with the patient efficiency of a federal investigator who understands that targets always move eventually for exactly this kind of move. Genevieve was in her office when Thomas appeared in the doorway. It was 7:40 in the evening. She had been reviewing documents. She looked up at his face, and she saw in the particular stillness of his expression that something had shifted. "He moved," Thomas said. She set down the document she was holding. "When?" 40 minutes ago. The channel, the message, the location, everything." He paused. "Agent Carroll is already coordinating. They want to move tonight." Genevieve was quiet for a moment. She looked at the document in her hand, then set it flat on the desk. "Is the evidence sufficient without the additional data attempt?" "More than sufficient," Thomas said. "The data attempt just closes the last door. Makes it airtight." A pause. "It's what he chose, Genevieve. Nobody pushed him toward it." "I know." She was quiet again. "Does my father know? He's been briefed." And Thomas almost smiled. Almost. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell her she doesn't have to be there tonight if she doesn't want to be. And tell her I'll understand either way." Genevieve looked at the city outside the window. The lights of it all, those lit windows, all those individual lives going about their particular evenings, completely unaware of what was happening in this office, in the offices below them, in the building across the city where Preston Hayes was sitting with his encrypted phone, believing he had found a way out. She had not hated him. She wanted to be clear about that, even just to herself, even just in the privacy of her own mind at 7:40 on a Tuesday evening. She had not built any of this out of hatred. Hatred is a fire that consumes the person holding it as much as anything it touches. She had learned that watching other people burn with it, she had made a different choice. What she felt thinking about Preston on the sidewalk with his box of belongings, thinking about the call where she had told him to get an attorney and meant it, what she felt was something closer to grief than rage. Grief for the years. Grief for the woman she had been when she was genuinely trying to make something work with someone who had never seen her clearly. Grief for the way cruelty becomes ordinary when it arrives quietly enough and consistently enough that you stop noticing it as cruelty and start experiencing it simply as weather. She had stopped standing in the rain. That was all. That was the whole story. "Tell Agent Carroll I'll be available by phone," she said, "but I won't be there in person tonight." A pause. "That's not where I need to be." Thomas nodded. He moved to leave. "Thomas," she said. He stopped. "Thank you. For the last 3 weeks." She meant it simply and completely without performance. "All of you, tell the team." He nodded again. He left. She sat alone in her office for a while after that, in the quiet that follows a long tension when it finally releases, and she thought about nothing in particular, and she looked at the city outside, and she felt the specific, strange lightness of a person who has carried something heavy for so long that the absence of the weight is its own kind of disorientation. Then she picked up her phone. She called her father. He answered immediately, as he always did, with the single word, "Jenin." "It's tonight," she said. "I know. I'm not going. I know that too." A pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between two people who have practiced being honest with each other across a great deal of distance and time. "How are you?" She thought about it. She gave him the true answer, not the assembled one. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I will be. I think I'm going to be better than I've been in a very long time." A pause. "Ask me again in the morning." "I will," Silas said. "Get some sleep." "I'll try." She ended the call. She turned off her office light. She walked to the elevator. She rode it down 49 floors and walked out into the night air of the city, and the city received her with its absolute democratic indifference, the same indifference it offered to every person who walked out of every building on every evening, regardless of what they were walking away from or toward. She walked 2 blocks before she got a car. And somewhere across the city, at that same moment in the location, Preston Hayes had named in his encrypted message a man who had spent 9 years building a life on the premise that he was the smartest person in every room, was learning in the most definitive way available exactly how wrong that premise had always been. The call came at 11:47 at night. Was all. Genevieve was not asleep. She had known she would not sleep, had not even attempted. It had instead sat in the small living room of her apartment with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and her phone face up on the cushion beside her. And she had waited with the particular quality of stillness that she had developed over 11 years of living with a man who required her to be always composed, always ready, always 1 degree removed from her own reactions. The number on the screen was Thomas Reed's. She picked up before the second ring. "It's done," Thomas said. 2 words. That was all. But in those 2 words, she heard the weight of everything that had been built over 3 weeks, over 8 months of her father's quiet accumulation, over 11 years of her own endurance. She heard the closing of something very large and very heavy. "Was anyone hurt?" she asked. Her first question. Thomas had noted later that it was always her first question. No, it went cleanly. He was at the location he specified. He accessed the system at 10:53. The surveillance activated automatically. Agent Carroll's team was already in position. A pause. He was placed under arrest at 11:02, 49 minutes ago. Genevieve was quiet. "He asked for you," Thomas said. "Not as a warning, not as a manipulation, simply as information delivered with the flat honesty she had come to rely on from him. When they had him in custody, he asked if you were there. When they told him you weren't, he asked them to call you." "I know," she said. "He called my phone. I didn't answer." "That's what I told Agent Carroll you would say." She almost smiled. Almost. Go home, Thomas. Get some sleep. You've earned it. So have you. She ended the call. She sat for a moment longer. Then she picked up her cold tea, walked to the kitchen, poured it out, and washed the cup. She did it slowly, deliberately. The way you do small tasks when you need your hands to be occupied so your mind can process what your hands are too simple to understand. Preston Hayes had been arrested at 11:02 on a Tuesday night. She had met him at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning 14 years ago when he had come into Callaway's for a business lunch, and she had been working the section, and he had asked her name, and she had told him, and he had smiled the kind of smile that she had not yet learned to read correctly. She had been 26. She had been tired in the specific way that people are tired when they are working very hard at something that is keeping them alive, but not yet building them toward anything. And he had smiled that smile, and she had smiled back, and she had thought, here is something new. 14 years, almost to the hour. She dried the cup. She put it back in the cabinet. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately, but she slept eventually, and when she slept without the low-grade vigilance that had accompanied her sleep for most of the last decade, the background process of monitoring, anticipating, preparing. That process was quiet now. For the first time in a very long time, the background was simply quiet. She woke at 6:15 to 17 missed calls. Not from Preston. His phone had been collected at 11:02. The calls were from 3 journalists, 2 of whom she had never heard of, and 1 of whom was from a financial news outlet that covered Coalbright Capital's industry with the particular appetite of a publication that understood its readers wanted blood as much as they wanted data. There were 4 texts from numbers she didn't recognize, 1 email from David Hargrove at Coalbright Capital sent at 2 in the morning, which she did not open, and a single text from her father sent at 6:08, which read, only, good morning. Breakfast. She texted back, yes. 1 hour. She showered. She dressed. She put on the gray blazer again, not as a statement, not as symbolism, simply because it was the blazer she reached for when she needed to feel like herself. And this morning, she needed to feel exactly like herself. By the time she arrived at the restaurant where her father was waiting, a small place, quiet, not the kind of place that made reservations difficult, or put its name in guides, the kind of place that Silas Archer had always preferred, specifically because it had no audience. The story had already broken. She knew it had broken because when she walked in and the host led her to the table where Silas was sitting with coffee and the newspaper he still read in physical form every morning, her father looked up at her and said simply, 17 minutes. 17 minutes since it broke. 17 minutes since I started counting how long it would take you to walk in here looking exactly like yourself. He poured her coffee. You look well. You look like you haven't slept. I slept fine. He handed her the coffee. I sleep fine when things go the way they should. She sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup. How bad is the coverage? Depends on your perspective. He opened the newspaper to a page he had already folded back. Not a front page story yet. The arrest had happened too late for print deadlines, but a column in the financial section, the kind of column written by someone with access to information before it was officially public, which told her something about how thoroughly the story had been seeded before last night. The headline read, Coalbright Capital executive arrested in federal sting sources indicate insider data scheme broader than initially disclosed. She read it. She read it carefully the way she read everything, without rushing, without reaction. Then she set the newspaper down and picked up the menu, which she already knew, because she had been coming to this restaurant with her father since she was small, since before she changed her name and moved to a different city, and decided to find out what she was made of without the scaffolding of the Archer name. She had found out. There's going to be a board meeting at Coalbright this morning, Silas said, watching her over his coffee cup. Extraordinary session. Hargrove called it at midnight. They'll be managing the disclosure, the client communications, the media positioning. He paused. They've already reached out to our legal team asking whether Archer Industries intends to increase its position. Do we? That depends on what you want to do next. She looked at him. What are my options? He set down his cup. He leaned back slightly, and she recognized the posture. It was the posture he adopted when he was about to lay out something he had already thought through completely, but wanted her to arrive at in her own way. He had been doing it since she was 8 years old, and it had never stopped being effective. Option 1, he said. We sell the position. We take the return, which is not insignificant, and we step back. We've done what we came to do. The federal case proceeds without us. Preston's consequences are his consequences. We move on. Option 2. We hold the position. We allow the Archer Industries stake to remain active through the legal proceedings, which gives us standing to participate in whatever corporate restructuring follows, which there will be significant restructuring. He paused. Colbright Capital is not a bad firm. It has been run badly in certain areas selectively by a man who understood how to hide things. Without that man, it could be run well, and it has assets worth preserving. She knew there was a third option. She waited. Option 3, he said. And now his voice shifted very slightly, the way it shifted when he was arriving at the thing he had actually been building toward. Archer Industries acquires a controlling interest. You take a seat on the board, not as my representative, as yourself. He looked at her steadily. Colbright Capital becomes part of the Archer portfolio restructured under new leadership, and you are part of that leadership. Not because of my name, because of what you've demonstrated over the last 3 weeks. The restaurant was quiet around them. A few other tables occupied by people having ordinary Wednesday morning breakfasts, unaware of the specific weight of the conversation happening across the room. Genevieve looked at her father. You've already started the acquisition process, she said. He didn't deny it. I've positioned us to move quickly if you want to move. I haven't moved yet. Because you wanted to ask me first. Because it's yours to decide. He picked up his coffee. It has always been yours to decide. Everything I've done in the last 8 months has been in the direction you pointed, not the other way around. She looked at the table, at the grain of the wood worn smooth from years of use. She thought about the conference room on the 41st floor with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its dark walnut furniture, chosen to communicate that the people who sat in it had already won. She thought about sitting on the wrong side of that table with flat hands and a gray blazer and the careless arc of a man's wrist sliding papers across a surface. She thought about what it meant to win, not in that room, not in the way that room defined winning, but actually. Option 3, she said. Silas nodded once. He picked up his cup. I'll make the calls this morning. I'll go to the board meeting. He paused with the cup halfway to his mouth. The Colbright board meeting. Yes. It starts in, he checked his watch, 2 hours and 20 minutes. Then I'll need to eat quickly. For the first time that morning, for the first time she realized since the car ride away from Meridian Tower 3 weeks ago. Silas Archer smiled. It was a small smile, contained the smile of a man who does not perform emotion, but occasionally cannot prevent it from surfacing. Order the eggs, he said. You'll need the protein. She was at Colbright Capital's board meeting at 9:15, not as an invited guest, not with advance notice, but with the specific authority granted by Archer Industries' governance rights as a 14% stakeholder in the parent holding company. Thomas Reed was with her. So was Diane Cho. They arrived exactly as the meeting was being called to order, and the disruption of their arrival. 3 people walking into an extraordinary board session that had not expected them produced the kind of room-shifting silence that Genevieve had come to recognize as the sound of power redistributing. David Hargrove looked at her from the head of the table. His expression was the complex expression of a man managing several competing reactions simultaneously. He was surprised. He was not entirely displeased, which told her that whatever he had been expecting from this morning was worse than the alternative she was offering. Ms. Archer, he said. Mr. Hargrove. She sat down at the table without being asked. Thomas and Diane sat on either side of her. I apologize for the short notice, but given this morning's circumstances, I thought it made more sense to be in the room. A pause. We all have the same interest here. Stability. I'd like to help provide it. Around the table, 7 board members looked at each other with the quick, involuntary eye contact of people checking the room's reaction before committing to their own. She had seen that look before. She understood what it meant. It meant nobody wants to be the first to push back, so everyone is waiting. She didn't wait for them. She opened the folder Thomas had placed in front of her, and she began to speak. Not about Preston. Not about the arrest. about Colbright Capital, its actual portfolio, its client base, its structural strengths, its 2 years of drift under a leadership culture that had allowed one man's concealed misconduct to metastasize without sufficient oversight. She spoke for 11 minutes without notes. She knew the numbers because she had spent 3 weeks learning them, not as a strategy for this specific room, but because you cannot make good decisions without understanding what you are deciding about. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Then a board member at the far end of the table, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Wald, who had been on the Colbright board for 8 years and whose reputation in the industry for being unmovable had been established long before Genevieve was tracking it, said, "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Archer?" "I'm proposing stability," Genevieve said. "Archer Industries increases its position to controlling interest. We provide an immediate capital infusion that covers the regulatory liability exposure. We restructure the executive leadership, and we build from the existing client base something worth keeping." She paused. "The alternative is that Colbright spends the next 18 months managing legal exposure, losing clients, and declining in value while the market watches. I don't think that serves anyone at this table." Patricia Wald looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at David Hargrove. Hargrove looked at Genevieve. "What's the timeline on the capital infusion?" he said. And she thought, there it is. That's the moment. 72 hours, she said. Another silence. Shorter this time. "Let's talk terms," Hargrove said. They talked terms for 3 hours. Thomas handled the structural details. Diane managed the numbers. Genevieve managed the room, the dynamics of it, the resistance in certain corners, the cautious interest in others, the way Patricia Wald's body language shifted over the course of the morning from skepticism to something approaching alignment. She knew how to read a room. She had always known how to read a room. She had spent 11 years pretending she didn't, so that the man across the breakfast table from her would remain comfortable. She was done being comfortable to make other people comfortable. At 12:41, they broke for lunch. Patricia Wald waited until the others had filed out and then crossed the room to where Genevieve was gathering her materials. "I knew your father," Patricia said, "years ago, before you were born probably." She paused. "He never talked about a daughter." "That was my choice," Genevieve said, "not his." Patricia looked at her with the assessing directness of a woman who had spent 40 years in rooms where directness was the only currency she trusted. "You could have come into this differently. You had the leverage to take this company apart, walk away with the assets and leave the structure to collapse." "Yes," Genevieve said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. She gave the honest answer. "Because there are people who work here who didn't do anything wrong. There are clients who trusted this institution. Collapsing it doesn't serve them." She paused. "And I'm not interested in destruction. I'm interested in what comes after it." Patricia Wald was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, the particular nod of someone who has evaluated something and found it genuinely sufficient. "I'll vote yes," she said, "this afternoon." She walked out. Genevieve stood alone in the boardroom for a moment. She looked at the table, different furniture from Meridian Tower's conference room, lighter, wood a longer surface, a different view from different windows. But fundamentally, the same kind of room. The kind of room where things were decided. Where power sat down and worked out what came next. She had sat on the wrong side of a table like this 3 weeks ago. She was on the right side now. Not because she had fought her way there, not because she had taken it, because she had always belonged there and she had chosen the moment to claim it. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she now recognized. Agent Carroll. It read, "Arraignment is scheduled for this afternoon at 3. He's requesting to see you beforehand. You are under no obligation to respond." She read it. She put her phone in her pocket. She walked back to her seat. She had a vote to win. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, in a federal courthouse across the city, Preston Hayes would be arraigned on charges of securities fraud, unauthorized data transfer, and attempted corporate espionage. He would stand before a judge in the suit he had been wearing the night before, which was now wrinkled, which was a detail that would strike him as acutely humiliating in a morning full of worse humiliations. He would hear the charges read. He would hear his bail set at a number that was large enough to be serious, and he would look across the courtroom instinctively for a face he recognized. a face that had been there in one form or another at every significant moment of his adult life. She was not there. She was in a boardroom 11 blocks away, preparing to take a vote that would reshape the institution he had spent 9 years building his career inside. And she was winning. Not because she was angry, not because she wanted to watch him fall, but because she was exactly as good at this as she had always known she was, and she had simply stopped pretending otherwise. Outside the courthouse after the arraignment, a woman from the financial news outlet caught up with Preston's new attorney on the steps. The attorney said, as attorneys say, that his client maintained his innocence and looked forward to the opportunity to present his defense. A separate journalist, one who had been tracking the Archer Industries acquisition story since morning, called Genevieve's office at 4:15 and asked for a comment. Her assistant, a young woman named Rachel, who had started 3 weeks ago and was already proving indispensable, took the call. She said in the pleasant and completely immovable way that Rachel had already mastered. Ms. Archer has no comment on personal matters. If you have questions about the Archer Industries acquisition of Coalbright Capital, our communications team will be happy to arrange a briefing. The journalist asked, "Is it true she was married to the man who was arrested this morning?" Rachel said, "Ms. Archer's focus is on the future of Coalbright Capital and its clients. Have a good afternoon." She ended the call. In her office, Genevieve heard this exchange through the open door and said nothing. She was looking at the city, the ordinary, indifferent, continuously forward-moving city. The vote had been 4-3 in favor. Patricia Wald had voted yes. Archer Industries was moving, and Genevieve Archer, who had once been a woman sitting on the wrong side of a table with flat hands and 11 years of carefully maintained silence, was now the person who had just decided what happened next to a 40-year-old financial institution. She thought about the $10,000. She almost laughed. Almost. The trial lasted 9 days. Not because the evidence was complex. The evidence was not complex. Priya Vasan's mapping, Thomas Reed's documentation, Agent Carroll's surveillance records, and the encrypted message logs that had been compromised for 11 days before Preston ever sent the message that ended his freedom together. They built a case that the prosecution described in their opening statement as one of the most thoroughly documented instances of sustained financial misconduct they had presented in this district in 14 years. 9 days because due process requires 9 days. Because every person, regardless of what they have done, is entitled to the full weight of the system considering them. Genevieve believed in that. She had said so once to Thomas Reed, who had looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent his career inside that system and found her faith in it more moving than he expected. She attended 3 of the 9 days. Not all of them, because attendance was not the point, and she had work to do, but 3. The first day, because beginnings matter. The 6th day, because that was the day the encrypted communications were entered into evidence, and the prosecutor read Preston's own words aloud in the courtroom, the message he had sent to Everett Cross, the specific and damning clarity of "I need access to the Archer file structure," the confident assumption of a man who believed he was operating in shadow, and she wanted to hear those words in the room where they would do the work they were meant to do. And the last day. Because endings matter too. Preston had looked at her on the first day. She had been seated in the gallery 3rd row between Marcus Webb and a woman from Agent Carroll's team, whose name she had learned, but whose role she didn't discuss with anyone outside the core group. Preston had been brought in and had scanned the gallery the way people scan for familiar faces, and when his eyes found her face, he had held her gaze for a long moment with an expression she had spent 11 years learning to read, and was now finally reading correctly. It was not anger. It was not defiance. It was not the contempt he had deployed so casually across so many years of shared mornings and boardroom hallways and that last conference room. It was the expression of a man who understood fully, and finally the size of what he had not understood. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked at the front of the courtroom where the judge was entering, and she did not look at Preston Hayes again. Everett Cross had pled guilty in a separate proceeding 2 weeks before the trial began, in exchange for cooperation and a reduced sentence. His testimony on day 4 was what prosecutors called the linchpin. the piece that connected the data-sharing arrangement to the broader pattern of misconduct that transformed a collection of individual violations into the coherent criminal narrative that the jury needed to convict. Everett Cross sat on the stand and answered every question in the flat, careful voice of a man who had made his calculation and was now executing it, and Preston's defense attorney objected 17 times and was sustained on 3 of them, and the other 14 objections simply underscored each time how little room remained for reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes. Genevieve was in her office at Colbright Capital, her office, the one she had taken on the executive floor 3 weeks after the board vote, after the restructuring had been formalized, and her role had been publicly announced, and the initial wave of media coverage had crested and begun to recede when Thomas called her with the verdict. "Guilty," he said, "all counts." She was standing at her window. She pressed her hand flat against the glass for a moment, feeling the cold of it against her palm, and she breathed. "All of them," she said, "every count. The jury didn't request clarification on anything. 4 hours and 12 minutes. A pause. "Sentencing is in 6 weeks. Thank you, Thomas." She ended the call. She stood at the window for a while. Below her, the city moved with its characteristic indifference, its continuous forward motion, its absolute refusal to pause for anyone's private reckoning. She had always loved that about cities. She loved it more now than she ever had. Her assistant Rachel appeared in the doorway. "The communications team is asking if you want to release a statement before the press gets to you. Tell them I'll have something for them in an hour." "Also," Rachel said, and her voice changed just slightly, the particular modulation of someone delivering secondary information that they suspect may be primary. "Your father called. He said he'll be at the usual place at 7 if you want dinner." "Tell him yes." She turned from the window. "And Rachel, what's the count on media requests this afternoon?" "As of 20 minutes ago, 41. Genevieve looked at her. "What's my schedule tomorrow morning?" "Clear until 10. Block it until noon, all of it." She sat down at her desk. "I have something I want to write." The statement she released that evening was not what the communications team had drafted. What the communications team had drafted was competent and careful and said approximately nothing in a large number of professionally assembled words. What Genevieve wrote in the hour she had given herself sitting at her desk with the door closed, and Rachel fielding the 41 media requests with the pleasant immovability that Rachel had made her signature, was something different. It was 6 paragraphs. It did not mention Preston Hayes by name. It did not describe the trial or the verdict or the evidence or any of the specific facts that journalists were already covering with breathless thoroughness. What it described was something smaller and more specific, and as it turned out, considerably more powerful than any of those things. It described 11 years of being told in 100 different ways, both direct and indirect, that she was less than she was. It described the specific erosion of that not dramatic, not violent, not the kind of abuse that announces itself in ways that are easy to identify and categorize, but the quiet, persistent daily architecture of dismissal that a certain kind of person builds around the people closest to them, the way it becomes ordinary, the way ordinary becomes invisible, the way invisible becomes the water you're swimming in without realizing you've forgotten what air feels like. It described the moment she signed the divorce papers, not as defeat, as decision. And it ended with a single paragraph that Rachel read over her shoulder when Genevieve finally opened her door, and that Rachel read without speaking for a moment, and that Rachel then said quietly, "This is going to matter to a lot of people." The paragraph read, "I am announcing today the Phoenix Initiative, a $50 million fund established through the Archer Family Foundation to provide financial counseling, legal support, and professional development resources to individuals who have experienced financial and emotional abuse within relationships. Because the most dangerous kind of control is the kind that convinces you it isn't control at all. And the most important kind of freedom is the kind you build yourself from the ground up after you have finally stopped mistaking silence for safety." She released the statement at 6:47 in the evening. By 9 o'clock that night, it had been shared 400,000 times. By the following morning, the number was past 2 million. The messages came from everywhere, from women in their 60s who said they had been waiting 30 years for someone to say exactly that in exactly those words, From men who said they had not understood what had been done to them until they read the third paragraph and had to put down their phones and sit with it. From adult children who recognized in her description the dynamic of their parents' marriage and felt for the first time that the thing they had watched growing up had a name. From professionals, from therapists, from advocates, from strangers who had no connection to finance or corporate law or anything related to the specific circumstances of Genevieve's story, but who recognized in it the shape of something universal. Diane Cho called her at 8 in the morning. "The Phoenix Initiative website crashed," she said. "Twice. Fix it." "We're fixing it." Also, the Archer Foundation has received 11 requests for partnership meetings from established nonprofits in the space before 9 a.m. A pause, and Genevieve could hear in Diane's voice the particular quality of someone who is surprised by being moved. "Genevieve, this is real. What you started here is real." "I know," she said. "That's why I started it." She was at the courthouse on sentencing day. She had not planned to speak, the prosecution had not requested a victim impact statement, and she had not volunteered one, and she was at peace with that, but she was present. She sat in the third row again between the same two people, and she watched Preston Hayes stand before the judge in his defense attorney's best attempt at a suit that communicated contrition, and she listened to the charges enumerated. And she listened to the defense's argument for leniency, which centered on Preston's professional accomplishments and community contributions, and which the judge listened to with the patient expression of someone who has heard this argument many times and finds it neither offensive nor persuasive. And she listened to the prosecution's response, which was brief and precise and required very few words because the evidence had already done the speaking. The judge sentenced Preston Hayes to 5 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole review after 3.5. Additionally, disgorgement of all profits identified in the scheme, a permanent bar from the securities industry, and restitution payments to affected clients totaling just over $1.2 million. 5 years. Permanent bar, restitution. The empire, such as it was gone. His attorney was already leaning in to speak quietly to him when Preston turned in his chair one final time and found Genevieve's face in the gallery. She was watching him. She had been watching him. She had not looked away during the sentencing, not because she wanted to see him diminished, that had never been what she wanted, not once, not even in the darkest hours of the last 3 weeks, but because she believed that the things you have endured deserve to be witness to their conclusion. She had endured this. She would witness its ending. He looked at her. His face did something complicated. She saw the beginning of words forming, saw him almost speak, saw the particular struggle of a man who has spent his life believing that the right words at the right moment could change any situation, and who is now understanding in the most definitive setting available that there are no right words for this moment. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she stood up, gathered her things, and walked out of the courtroom. In the corridor, Marcus Webb fell into step beside her. He had been there too every day of the trial. She had not asked him to come. He had simply been there because he was that kind of person, and she was glad. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question with the same care she gave all questions. Like something that has been held in tension for a very long time has finally been allowed to be at rest, she said. Not happy exactly, not relieved exactly. She thought about it. Complete. I feel complete. Marcus nodded. He understood this, she could see. He had seen enough endings to understand that the ones that actually resolve things rarely feel the way people expect them to feel. They don't feel like victory. They feel like the absence of something you had stopped noticing you were carrying. Outside the courthouse, the steps were crowded. Journalists' cameras, the specific organized chaos of a media presence at a significant verdict. She had anticipated this. Rachel had been briefed. The communications team had a plan. But before she reached her waiting car, a woman stepped out of the crowd. Not a journalist. No press badge, no camera, no recorder extended. A woman in her early 50s, neatly dressed with the kind of face that carries its history, visibly the lines of it written clearly in the years around her eyes and mouth. "Ms. Archer," the woman said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "I read what you wrote last night. I read it 3 times. She stopped. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I've been in my situation for 19 years. I never had the words for it. I never believed that anyone would understand. She stopped again. I just wanted you to know. You gave me the words. Genevieve looked at her. She looked at this woman who had stood in a crowd outside a courthouse to say this one thing, and she felt something move in her chest that was not grief and not triumph, and not the complex, incomplete emotion of the courtroom. It was simpler than all of those things, cleaner. What's your name? Genevieve said. The woman blinked as if she hadn't expected to be asked. Carol. Carol. Genevieve held her gaze. The Phoenix Initiative's first counseling center opens in 3 months, in this city. If you want to come, the information is on the website. She paused. Will you come? Carol looked at her for a moment. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. She held it the way certain people hold things with the practiced containment of someone who has been holding things for a long time. Yes, she said, I'll come. Genevieve nodded once. She touched Carol's hand briefly without theatrics, without performance. Then she walked to her car. Silas was already inside it. She got in. The door closed. The city began to move past the window. How was it? He said. Not the verdict. He knew the verdict. He meant the rest of it. There was a woman on the steps, she said. Carol, 19 years. Silas was quiet. That's why I built it, she said. Not for the verdict, not for any of this. For Carol, for however many Carols there are. She looked out the window. Are there enough resources for the first year if the response continues at this level? I've already spoken to the foundation, he said. We can scale the initial commitment if necessary. The $50 million was a floor, not a ceiling. She nodded. They rode in silence for a while, the good silence. The silence of two people who have been through something significant together and do not need to narrate it to each other. Then Silas said quietly, Your mother would have been proud of you. She had not expected that. She felt it land in the center of her chest with the particular weight of things said by the right person at the right moment. She looked at her father's profile, at the 70-year-old man who had sat in the back of a conference room and folded his hands and watched and waited because she had asked him to wait, who had spent 8 months building quietly toward a moment she had chosen, who had never once told her what to do or how to be or who to become. I know, she said. Her voice was steady. I know she would have. He reached over and covered her hand with his for a moment. Then he removed it. Then they both looked forward at the city moving ahead of them through the windshield, ordinary and continuous and completely indifferent to the question of what any individual person had been through to arrive at this particular Tuesday afternoon. 6 weeks later, on a cold morning in early November, the Phoenix Initiative opened its first counseling center in a building 3 blocks from a courthouse that Genevieve had walked out of without looking back. The opening was quiet by design. No cameras inside, no journalists past the lobby. A small gathering of staff volunteers, foundation representatives, and a carefully selected group of women and men who had agreed to be present as the first clients, the first people to walk through the door that the initiative had built. Carol was among them. Genevieve shook her hand at the door. You came, she said. I told you I would, Carol said. Inside, there were counselors and financial advisors and a legal team that worked on sliding scale fees and in many cases no fees at all. There were private rooms with good lighting. There were people whose entire professional purpose was to sit across from someone who had been told in 100 quiet ways that they were less than they were and to say you are not. You never were. Here's how we begin. Genevieve did not stay long. She was not the story here. She had never been the story. Not really. The story had always been larger than her had always been about the shape of a particular kind of harm and what it takes to move through it and out the other side. She had simply been the person in a position to name it, to fund it, to stand outside a courthouse in a gray blazer and say, this happened to me, and it happens to more people than you know. And silence is not weakness. It is survival before transformation. She walked back out to where her car was waiting. Rachel was already on the phone managing the morning's schedule. Thomas had sent 3 documents that required her review before noon. Diane had flagged 2 items from the Colbright restructuring that needed her decision before the afternoon call. The work continued. It always continued. That was not a burden. That was the point. She got in the car. She did not look back at the building. She looked forward at the city ahead of her, at the ordinary irreversible motion of a Tuesday morning in November, And she felt underneath the work, underneath the schedule, underneath the accumulated weight and purpose of everything she had built, and was still building the specific clean lightness of a woman who knows exactly who she is. Genevieve Archer had walked into a room to give something up. She had walked out of it to claim everything, and she never looked back.